April 15th, 1815, and the chandeliers of Harrington House blazed with 1,000 candles, casting warmth across the assembled glittering crowd below. Yet Miss Harriet Sinclair felt only the familiar chill of invisibility as she stood along the periphery of the grand ballroom in her pale blue gown, a dress that had been fashionable perhaps 3 seasons prior, but which she had carefully maintained because there was little prospect of replacing it with anything finer. At 28, she had long resigned herself to her position in society's carefully ordered hierarchy, somewhere between the pitied spinster and the entirely forgotten, a woman of modest fortune and plainer features who had learned through painful repetition that hope was a luxury she could ill afford. The orchestra struck up a lively country dance, and around her swirled silk and satin in jewel tones, emeralds and rubies and sapphires adorning throats and ears and wrists, while conversation hummed with that particular energy that accompanies the early hours of a ball, when expectations still run high and possibilities seem endless to those fortunate enough to warrant attention. She watched as Lady Caroline Pembroke, resplendent in emerald silk that matched the stones at her throat, held court near the center of the room, her laugh carrying across the space with that practiced musicality that suggested both charm and something sharper beneath. And Harriet felt rather than saw the occasional glance in her direction, the kind that assessed and dismissed in a single sweep. His Grace the Duke of Thornhill stood near the tall windows overlooking the gardens, his dark evening attire immaculate, his posture suggesting a man fulfilling obligation rather than seeking pleasure. And though Harriet had never exchanged more than the briefest courtesy with him at previous gatherings, she was aware of him in the way one becomes aware of sunlight even with closed eyes, an awareness born of being in the same social sphere, yet separated by an unbridgeable gulf of rank and consequence. When Lady Caroline approached him with her dance card extended, and that smile that had launched 100 courtships, Harriet turned her attention to the potted palms beside her, finding them suddenly fascinating. But she could not help but hear the exchange, could not help but notice when Caroline gestured toward the row of young ladies awaiting presentation, a carefully curated selection of the season's finest offerings. The Duke moved through the ritual with admirable grace, inscribing his name on card after card, and Harriet told herself she had no expectation of being included, no right to feel the small twist in her chest when he progressed down the line, and she realized with creeping mortification that Caroline had positioned her at the end. And then the moment arrived when he reached the young lady beside her, a pretty blonde in white, whose giggle suggested youth and prospects, and he completed that final inscription before Caroline smoothly turned him back toward the center of the room, the circuit complete, and Harriet understood with perfect clarity that she had been deliberately arranged to appear part of the line, yet excluded from its ultimate purpose. She stood very still, her gloved hands folded carefully at her waist, her expression composed into the serene mask she had perfected over years of similar slights, and she did not allow herself to look around to see who might have witnessed her exclusion, did not permit the heat rising in her cheeks to manifest as tears, but simply remained in place like a decorative element of the ballroom itself, present but unnoticed, overlooked once again by design. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The hour had advanced to 10 in the evening when Alexander Thornhill found himself standing near the refreshment table with a glass of champagne he had no intention of drinking. His attention caught not by the swirl of dancers before him, but by a notable absence, for the woman in the pale blue gown who had stood at the end of that carefully arranged line had vanished from the ballroom, and he experienced an uncomfortable stirring of something that might have been guilt or perhaps simply curiosity about where she had gone, and why the memory of her composed expression as he had passed her by now, troubled him in a way the evening's other social obligations had not. He had performed the dance card ritual so many times that it had become mere routine, a series of names and faces that blurred together into an indistinguishable mass of eager smiles and fluttering fans. Yet now he found himself trying to recall the exact moment when Lady Caroline had turned him away from that final figure, and he realized with growing discomfort that the maneuver had been deliberate, designed to exclude while maintaining the appearance of inclusion, a cruelty he had unwittingly participated in simply by failing to pay attention. Through the open terrace doors he caught a glimpse of pale blue fabric, and moved without conscious decision toward it, stepping out into the cooler air of the spring evening, where the music floated more softly, and the blaze of candlelight gave way to gentler illumination from lanterns strung along the balustrade. She stood with her back to him, her posture perfect, her hands resting on the stone railing as she looked out over the darkened gardens below, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that spoke of carefully maintained dignity rather than defeat. A quiet strength that arrested him before he could retreat back into the ballroom unnoticed. Before he could determine whether to speak or withdraw, another woman emerged onto the terrace, this one in a champagne-colored dress that caught the lantern light, and he recognized Miss Louisa Fairfax, who moved directly to the woman in blue and placed a gentle hand upon her arm. Alexander stepped back into the shadows near the doorway, not from any intentional desire to eavesdrop, but simply because retreat now would draw more attention than remaining still, and thus he heard Miss Fairfax say in a voice warm with affection and sharp with anger, "Miss Harriet, you must not let Caroline's petty machinations wound you, for she arranged that tableau specifically to mortify you and used his grace as her instrument." The name settled into his consciousness with uncomfortable weight. Miss Harriet. He should know her full name, should recognize her from previous encounters, yet he could not with any certainty say he had ever truly noticed her before this moment. Miss Fairfax continued, speaking with the passion of true friendship. "You possess more intelligence and genuine worth in your smallest finger than Caroline holds in her entire fashionably dressed person, and any man who cannot perceive that is not worthy of your notice, duke or otherwise." Alexander felt heat rise in his collar at this pronouncement, particularly as it was entirely justified. The woman called Harriet, Miss Harriet Sinclair he now presumed, turned slightly, and he caught a glimpse of her profile, features that might not inspire poetry, but held a certain quiet appeal. And more importantly, an expression of acceptance rather than self-pity. As she replied in a voice lower and more melodious than he had expected, "Dear Louisa, I have long since accepted my place in society's estimation, and I do not hold His Grace accountable for failing to notice what no one else has deemed worthy of attention either." April 16th, 1815, arrived with rain pattering against the windows of the Sinclair residence, a modest but respectable townhouse in a quieter corner of Mayfair, where faded elegance spoke of genteel poverty rather than outright deprivation, and Harriet sat in the drawing-room, attempting to focus on her embroidery, while her mother, Mrs. Eleanor Sinclair, presided over the teapot with that particular serenity that came from years of managing reduced circumstances with grace. The room itself reflected their situation with furniture that had been fashionable 20 years prior but remained well-maintained, shelves lined with books that spoke of intellectual interests pursued despite financial limitations, and curtains that had been turned and re-hemmed so many times that only the most discerning eye could detect their true age. Yet there persisted an atmosphere of warmth and cultivation that no amount of money could manufacture artificially. Harriet had said nothing to her mother about the previous evening's humiliation. For what purpose would it serve to relate yet another instance of social slight when both of them understood perfectly well her position in society's estimation? but she found her needle stabbing the fabric with more force than strictly necessary as she recalled that moment of standing overlooked at the end of Lady Caroline's carefully arranged line. When Morrison, their elderly butler, who served also as footman and general factotum, appeared in the doorway at precisely 11 in the morning with an expression of barely concealed astonishment, Harriet expected nothing more remarkable than perhaps a tradesman calling about an account. But his announcement that His Grace the Duke of Thornhill requested the honour of being received sent a shock through her system so profound that she stabbed her finger with the needle and drew blood. Her mother's teacup paused halfway to her lips, suspended in that moment of surprise, before Eleanor set it down with admirable composure and said in a voice that betrayed only the slightest tremor that His Grace should, of course, be shown in immediately, and Harriet found herself standing without conscious volition, pressing her bleeding finger against her simple grey mourning dress in a manner that would likely leave a stain she could ill afford. He entered the room bringing with him the scent of rain and something else, perhaps bergamot or sandalwood, his dark hair slightly damp despite what must have been a covered carriage, his morning attire impeccable in that way that spoke of expert tailoring and unconscious wealth, and his expression held something she could not quite identify, discomfort perhaps, or determination. As he bowed with perfect formality, first to her mother and then to her with equal respect, rather than the cursory acknowledgment she might have expected. Eleanor performed the social niceties with practiced skill, offering refreshment, which he declined, commenting on the weather, which he acknowledged, and then with a perception that surprised Harriet, though perhaps it should not have given Eleanor's years of navigating social complexities, her mother invented a sudden pressing need to consult with the housekeeper about some entirely fictitious domestic crisis, and withdrew from the room with a speed that belied her 50 years, leaving Harriet standing beside the worn sofa with her heart beating so forcefully she feared he must surely hear it, wondering what circumstance could possibly have brought the Duke of Thornhill to her drawing-room on a rainy Tuesday morning when by all rights he should have forgotten her existence entirely. April 18th, 1815 arrived with the kind of brilliant spring sunshine that made Hyde Park irresistible to fashionable society, and by 3 in the afternoon the pathways were crowded with carriages and riders and pedestrians, all engaged in that peculiar ritual of seeing and being seen that constituted the social heart of the London season, the air filled with the scent of early blooms and hoarse and expensive perfumes as ladies twirled parasols and gentlemen tipped hats in an endless choreography of status and recognition. Harriet walked beside Louisa along the less fashionable paths where they might admire the greenery without subjecting themselves to excessive scrutiny, her simple walking dress of pale green muslin marking her as someone of respectable but unremarkable means, her bonnet trimmed with ribbon rather than the elaborate feathers that adorned the heads of wealthier women. And she told herself firmly that she was content with this peripheral existence, even as her heart beat faster with the irrational hope that she might glimpse a certain dark-haired gentleman on his black stallion. His call 2 days prior had unsettled her profoundly, not merely because of the apology he had delivered with what seemed genuine regret, but because of the conversation that had followed, ranging across topics from literature to philosophy to the absurdities of social convention, and she had found herself speaking with an ease that surprised her until she remembered that she had nothing to lose, since surely he would not call again, and therefore she need not guard her tongue or pretend to opinions she did not hold. Yet here she was, scanning the crowds with an attention she despised in herself, wondering if his appearance at her home had been merely the discharge of an obligation or something more. And she was so absorbed in these circular thoughts that she did not notice the ripple of attention moving through the crowd until Louisa gripped her arm and said in a voice tight with some emotion Harriet could not identify, that His Grace appeared to be riding directly toward them. Indeed, the black stallion was unmistakable. as was the figure astride it, and Alexander Thornhill guided his mount off the main path onto the smaller walk where they stood, with a deliberateness that suggested intention rather than accident, dismounting with fluid grace and bowing over first Louisa's hand and then Harriet's with that same equal respect he had shown in her drawing-room. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby crowd. "I had hoped I might encounter you here, for I find that our conversation the other morning left me with several questions I should like to continue discussing if you would grant me the honor of walking with you for a time." Harriet felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them, heard the whisper of fans snapping open to shield mouths that delivered speculation and surprise to eager ears, and saw over Alexander's shoulder the unmistakable figure of Lady Caroline Pembroke, frozen in the act of descending from her barouche, emerald silk and fury combined in equal measure as she witnessed the Duke of Thornhill publicly seeking out the company of the woman she had deliberately humiliated not 3 days past. April 22nd, 1815, arrived with soft afternoon light filtering through the windows of Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, illuminating the dust motes that danced above crowded shelves where leather-bound volumes exhaled the particular fragrance of paper and ink and knowledge accumulated across centuries. And Harriet moved through the narrow aisles with the ease of long familiarity, her brown walking dress practical for an excursion undertaken without expectation of encountering fashionable society. Her fingers trailing along spines as she searched for the second volume of a novel whose first installment had left her suspended in anticipation for a fortnight. She had come alone, save for their maid waiting outside, for this was one liberty her mother permitted given the respectable nature of the establishment, and Harriet's advanced age, which freed her from the strictest chaperoning requirements that governed younger women, and she felt herself relaxing in this space, where her true self might emerge without the constant guardedness required in drawing-rooms where every word and gesture faced scrutiny and judgment. The past 4 days since that encounter in Hyde Park had been peculiar beyond description, with Alexander calling twice more at the Sinclair residence for conversations that ranged across subjects no gentleman had ever bothered to discuss with her, his attention focused and genuine in a manner that both thrilled and terrified her. Yet she had not dared imagine encountering him here in this sanctuary she had always considered solely her own. Therefore, when she rounded the corner of the philosophy section and nearly collided with a tall figure examining a volume of Locke, her startled gasp drew his attention, and those grey eyes she had begun seeing in her dreams focused on her with an expression of pleasure so unfeigned that her heart performed that now familiar acceleration that left her breathless and slightly dizzy. "Miss Sinclair," he said, and the warmth in his voice suggested he found this accidental meeting as felicitous as she found it alarming. "I had not hoped to find you here, though perhaps I should have guessed that a woman of your evident learning would frequent the finest bookshop in London," and she found herself smiling despite her determination to maintain proper reserve, confessing that she came here whenever funds and time permitted for it was her favorite refuge in a city that often felt overwhelming in its noise and crowds and relentless social performance. What followed was the most extraordinary hour of Harriet's life as they moved through the shop, discussing literature and philosophy and history, their conversation flowing with an ease that felt almost dangerous in its intimacy. And she discovered that he had read widely and thought deeply and held opinions that challenged her own in ways that stimulated rather than offended. His questions, genuine invitations to share her thoughts rather than polite formalities masking disinterest. She found herself laughing. Actual unreserved laughter, when he offered a wry observation about a popular novel they both found tedious despite its fashionable status. And the sound of her own mirth startled her, for she could not recall the last time she had felt free enough to express such genuine amusement. Alexander was watching her with an intensity that should have discomfited her, but instead felt like recognition, as though he were seeing something in her that she had believed invisible. And when another gentleman entered the shop and called out a greeting, she was introduced to Lord George Westbrook, whose knowing look and poorly suppressed smile suggested he understood exactly what he was witnessing and approved wholeheartedly. As they prepared to depart, Alexander selected a slim volume of poetry and insisted on purchasing it as a gift, pressing it into her hands with a look that made the book feel like something far more significant than its modest size suggested. And Harriet walked home clutching it to her chest like a talisman against the doubts that whispered she was foolish to hope. April 25th, 1815 arrived with an expectation that sat like anticipation and dread combined in Harriet's chest. As her mother fastened the last button on the rose-colored gown that had been delivered just that morning from the modiste, paid for, she suspected, by funds her mother had been saving for something far more practical than a ball gown, the silk whispering against her skin in a way that felt almost decadent after years of wearing serviceable muslins that prioritized economy over beauty. And though the looking-glass showed her the same unremarkable features she had always possessed, something in her eyes looked different. Perhaps hope, or perhaps merely the reflection of candlelight on fabric that actually flattered her modest figure instead of merely covering it. Lord Somerset's ball was already well attended when they arrived at 9:30, the ballroom glittering with hundreds of candles in crystal chandeliers that cast dancing light across polished floors where couples moved through a country dance, and Harriet felt the familiar urge to find a chair against the wall where she might observe rather than participate. But Louisa gripped her arm with surprising firmness and whispered that His Grace had already arrived, and was at that very moment scanning the room with what looked distinctly like anticipation rather than his usual expression of aristocratic boredom. Indeed, when Alexander's gaze found her across the crowded space, something shifted in his features, a warming that made her breath catch as he began moving through the crowd with purpose, and she was aware of heads turning to follow his progress, of whispers behind fans that had been her constant accompaniment for the past week since their encounter at Hatchard's had been witnessed and reported and speculated upon by half of London. He bowed before her with that grace that seemed effortless despite his considerable height, his evening attire of black superfine and pristine white linen making him appear every inch the duke he was. Yet when he raised his eyes to hers, there was something in them that spoke not of rank or consequence, but of genuine pleasure at seeing her. "Miss Sinclair," he said, and his voice carried a warmth that seemed meant for her alone, despite the dozens listening. "I believe the orchestra is about to begin a waltz, and I find myself hoping desperately that you might honor me with this dance, for I have thought of little else these past 3 days but the opportunity to continue our conversation, though I confess that dancing allows far less discussion than I would prefer, yet offers certain other advantages that make it worthwhile nonetheless." Harriet felt heat rise in her cheeks at something in his tone that seemed to promise those advantages were not merely the music or the movement, but something far more intimate, and when she placed her gloved hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor, she was trembling with a nervousness that had nothing to do with her dancing ability, and everything to do with the way his hand settled at her waist as the first strains of Strauss filled the air, the touch burning through silk and stays and shift to the skin beneath, as though no barrier existed between them at all. And then they were moving, spinning through candlelight and watching eyes. And Harriet discovered that dancing with Alexander Thornhill was unlike any waltz she had ever experienced in her limited history of being occasionally asked to dance by gentlemen fulfilling obligations or seeking partners when more desirable women were already claimed. April 28th, 1815 dawned grey and weeping, rain streaking the windows of the Sinclair residence as Harriet dressed in a simple white day dress, that seemed to mirror the bleached quality of her spirits. For the past 3 days, since that extraordinary waltz had brought a confusion of emotions she scarcely knew how to navigate. Hope warring with a dread she could not name, but felt like premonition settling cold beneath her ribs. Her mother had suggested an outing to the milliner on Bond Street to order new ribbons for her bonnet, an extravagance they could ill afford, but which Eleanor insisted was necessary now that Harriet was receiving such marked attention from His Grace. And so at 10 that morning they set out in a hired hack through streets slick with rain where puddles reflected the leaden sky like tarnished mirrors. The milliner's shop was warm and fragrant, with the smell of dyed fabric and fresh flowers used to trim bonnets, and Harriet was examining a display of silk ribbons in a shade of blue that reminded her of Alexander's eyes, when she heard voices from behind a tall display of hat forms, feminine voices pitched in that particular tone that indicated gossip of the most delicious variety was being exchanged. She should have moved away, should have announced her presence, but something in the mention of a certain duke's name froze her in place as Lady Caroline Pembroke's unmistakable drawl pronounced with evident satisfaction that the entire affair was clearly nothing more than an amusing diversion for a man of Thornhill's sophistication. For what else could explain his sudden interest in a woman who had been on the shelf so long she had gathered dust? Unless perhaps it was a wager among the gentlemen at White's to see if even the plainest spinster in London could be made to believe herself desirable. Another voice, which Harriet recognized as belonging to Miss Sophia Beaumont, added with a laugh that perhaps His Grace was performing an act of charity, for everyone knew the Sinclairs were living on the edge of genteel poverty, and perhaps he felt obligated to raise the poor creature's spirits before abandoning her to her inevitable fate as a governess or companion to some elderly relative. The words struck like physical blows, each one finding the vulnerable places in Harriet's heart where hope had been tentatively growing, and she felt the blood drain from her face as her mother's hand gripped her arm with surprising strength. Whether to offer comfort or prevent her from fleeing, Harriet could not determine. Caroline continued in a tone of false sympathy that it was really quite cruel when one thought about it, for Miss Sinclair would undoubtedly develop expectations that could never be fulfilled. And when the Duke tired of his little experiment and returned his attention to women of appropriate beauty and consequence, the disappointment would be all the more devastating for having been allowed to hope. Harriet did not remember leaving the shop, only found herself outside in the rain without proper covering, the water soaking through her spencer and plastering her hair to her face in a way that disguised the tears she could not prevent from falling. And though Louisa arrived within the hour after being summoned by Eleanor, though her friend spoke with passionate conviction about the obvious sincerity of Alexander's regard and the malicious invention of Caroline's cruel words, Harriet could not silence the voice of doubt that whispered she had been a fool to believe that a man like the Duke of Thornhill could truly want a woman like her for anything more than temporary amusement or charitable obligation. May the Waltz 1815 arrived with skies still heavy and grey, the rain of 3 days prior having settled into a persistent drizzle that matched the bleakness in Harriet's heart as she sat in the drawing-room, pretending to occupy herself with embroidery, while her mother watched with worried eyes that spoke of a concern Harriet could not bear to address. For how could she explain that she had been foolish enough to hope, to believe even for a moment that a man like Alexander Thornhill could genuinely desire her company for anything beyond temporary amusement, or worse, charitable obligation? At precisely noon the knocker sounded, and Harriet felt her heart lurch with a painful combination of longing and dread as she heard the familiar deep voice requesting admittance. But before the maid could respond, she found herself speaking in a voice that sounded foreign to her own ears, instructing that she was not at home to callers, not today, not to anyone. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by her mother's sharp intake of breath, and the sound of retreating footsteps on the front steps, and Harriet discovered that protecting oneself from potential pain brought no relief, only a different kind of anguish that settled like a stone in her chest. Meanwhile, outside the Sinclair residence, Alexander stood on the rain-slicked pavement, staring at the closed door with a confusion that rapidly transformed into something closer to alarm, for he had called every day since their waltz and been received with warm welcome, and this sudden withdrawal spoke of something having gone terribly wrong in the 3 days since he had last seen her. He returned to his townhouse on Grosvenor Square, where he paced the length of his study like a caged animal, ignoring the stack of correspondence requiring his attention and the meeting with his steward that he had postponed twice already. His mind occupied entirely with the question of what could have caused Harriet to refuse him when their last parting had been marked by smiles that suggested she shared at least some measure of the regard that had taken root in his own heart with startling rapidity and strength. Lord George Westbrook found him there an hour later, still pacing, and settled himself in a chair with the ease of long friendship, before observing that Alexander looked like a man whose horse had gone lame or whose favorite hound had died, which assessment earned him a glare that would have intimidated a lesser man, but only made George grin. When Alexander explained the situation, his friend's expression sobered, and George spoke with unusual seriousness about the vulnerability of women like Miss Sinclair, who had been overlooked and dismissed by society for so long that genuine attention must seem too extraordinary to be trusted, especially when vicious tongues like Caroline Pemberton's were undoubtedly spreading poison about wages and charity and cruel amusement at the expense of plain spinsters who should know better than to hope. Alexander felt rage kindle in his chest at the thought of Harriet being subjected to such cruelty, followed immediately by a determination so fierce it surprised even himself, for he had spent 32 years avoiding the marriage market and the shallow debutantes who populated it. Yet here he stood ready to wage war against the entirety of London society, if necessary, to prove to one overlooked woman with intelligent eyes and a dignity that humbled him that his regard was not amusement or obligation, but something far deeper and more permanent than he had imagined himself capable of feeling. May 3rd, 1815, arrived with clearer skies, the persistent rain of the previous days giving way to hesitant sunshine that did nothing to lift the weight in Harriet's chest as she sat in the drawing-room, with embroidery lying untouched in her lap. 2 days having passed since she had refused Alexander's call, and each hour seeming to confirm the wisdom of her self-protective retreat, even as her heart ached with a loss that felt disproportionate for something she had possessed so briefly and uncertainly. Meanwhile, across Mayfair in his study on Grosvenor Square, Alexander sat across the desk from Mr. Theodore Pemberton, his banker and man of business, outlining a plan so audacious that the normally unflappable gentleman's eyebrows had risen nearly to his hairline as he protested that such an undertaking would require considerable expense and create unprecedented social disruption, to which Alexander responded with a smile that held no humor that he had wealth enough to afford any expense and cared nothing for social disruption when weighed against the necessity of proving to one stubborn woman that his regard was neither jest nor charity, but the most serious intent he had ever possessed. By 4th of that afternoon, the first transactions had been completed, Alexander presenting himself at the homes of 3 prominent hostesses scheduled to hold balls within the week and making an offer that was both financially generous and socially impossible to refuse, that he would underwrite the entire cost of their entertainments in exchange for the exclusive rights to every waltz on their dance cards, a request so unusual that Lady Pemberton had actually laughed before realizing he was entirely serious. The gossip began spreading through London's drawing-rooms with the speed of fire through dry kindling, reaching Louisa Fairfax by that evening, as she took tea with her married sister, who had heard it from Lady Westbrook, who had it directly from her husband George, that the Duke of Thornhill had apparently taken leave of his senses and was attempting to purchase every waltz at every ball in London, though for what purpose no one could quite determine, unless it was somehow connected to his recent, and now apparently abandoned, pursuit of poor Miss Sinclair. Louisa arrived at the Sinclair residence the following morning with eyes bright with purpose and a determination to pierce through her friend's protective retreat, and though Harriet initially insisted she had no interest in hearing gossip about His Grace, her resolve crumbled when Louisa revealed what Alexander was doing and the sheer scale of his unprecedented gesture. Still, Harriet's first response was doubt, the voice of insecurity whispering that perhaps this was merely another form of charity, or worse, a way of ensuring no other woman would be subjected to his attentions. But Louisa gripped her hands with surprising strength and asked with perfect logic why a man would go to such extraordinary public expense and effort for any reason other than the most sincere desire to prove himself worthy of notice to the one woman whose absence from his life had become intolerable. And for the first time since that terrible morning in the milliner's shop, Harriet felt the fragile stirring of something that might become hope if she were brave enough to believe what her heart whispered might be possible. May 5th, 1815, dawned with the kind of brilliant sunshine that seemed to herald something momentous. And by that evening, every drawing-room in Mayfair buzzed with the astounding news that His Grace the Duke of Thornhill had appeared at Lady Pemberton's ball and claimed not one or two, but every single waltz on the programme, leaving a ballroom full of bewildered young ladies and their stunned mammas staring as he danced each set with an empty space in his arms, moving through the motions with perfect form, while partnering only air and his own determination. By May 6th, the phenomenon had repeated at Lord Ashworth's assembly, where Alexander once again purchased exclusive rights to all waltzes and danced them alone, while society watched with a mixture of fascination and confusion, and the gossip networks that had so recently carried cruel whispers about Miss Sinclair now churned with wilder speculation about what madness or purpose drove a duke to such unprecedented behavior. May 7th brought warmer weather, and the sight of Alexander appearing at the Beaumont Musicale, where he paid an outrageous sum for the privilege of claiming 3 waltzes and executing them with solemn precision, while the assembled guests whispered behind fans and gloves, and it was Lady Westbrook who finally voiced what the sharper minds among the ton had begun to suspect, that perhaps His Grace was not dancing alone at all, but rather dancing with the memory or hope of one particular absent partner. The flowers began arriving at the Sinclair residence on May 8th, great extravagant arrangements of white roses and jasmine that filled the modest drawing-room with fragrance and made Eleanor Sinclair weep with joy, while Harriet stood frozen between disbelief and a terror that if she allowed herself to hope, she would shatter entirely when it proved to be some elaborate misunderstanding. Louisa called every day with fresh reports, describing how Alexander had attended no fewer than 7 events over the course of 5 days and claimed every waltz at each one, how he deflected all questions with polite stoniness, but made no secret of his purpose, how Caroline Pemberton had attempted to position herself, to intercept him at the Carstairs ball, only to be ignored so thoroughly it amounted to a public cut that sent her fleeing in humiliation. By May 9th, the entire ton understood what was happening. That the Duke of Thornhill was making a statement so public and so extravagant that it could not be mistaken for anything but the most serious courtship declaration, and mothers who had previously dismissed Harriet Sinclair as beneath notice now spoke her name with envious respect, while calculating what they had missed in their assessment of a woman who could inspire such devotion. On May 10th, Harriet's mother took her hands across the breakfast table, where yet another massive arrangement of white roses commanded the center, and spoke with gentle firmness about the courage required not just to hope, but to accept that sometimes hope proved justified, that sometimes the extraordinary happened to ordinary people, and that refusing to believe in one's own worthiness of love was its own form of cowardice that Harriet had never shown in any other aspect of her life. May 12, 1815, arrived with unseasonable warmth that seemed to mirror the feverish uncertainty in Harriet's chest as she stood before her mirror at 7 in the evening, wearing a new gown of ivory silk that her mother had insisted upon purchasing, the fabric catching the candlelight in ways her old dresses never had, while Louisa fastened the tiny pearl buttons along her spine and spoke with gentle firmness about the necessity of hearing truth directly from its source, rather than allowing fear to write the ending of a story that had barely begun. Lady Beaumont's ball glittered with particular brilliance when Harriet arrived shortly past 8. The conservatory visible through the ballroom's eastern windows, with its glass panes reflecting lamplight, and the dark shapes of exotic plants creating shadows that seemed to offer the privacy that Harriet both craved and feared. As she moved through the crowd with her heart beating so forcefully, she wondered if others could hear it over the orchestra's opening strains. Alexander saw her the moment she entered, his body going still in the midst of conversation with Lord Ashworth, and something passed across his face that was too swift and complex to name, before he excused himself with a terseness that bordered on rudeness, and began moving toward her with an intensity of purpose that made several guests step back instinctively. They met near the refreshment table, where neither punch nor lemonade held any interest, and Harriet found her carefully rehearsed words dissolving under the weight of his gaze, as he asked with a roughness she had never heard in his typically controlled voice, whether she had received his letters, his flowers, whether she understood what he had been attempting to communicate through actions since she had refused him the opportunity to use words. She managed to say that she had received everything, but did not understand, could not fathom why a duke would make such a public spectacle unless it was some form of penance or obligation, and the flash of pain that crossed his features made her immediately regret the accusation, even as she needed to voice it. He glanced around at the watching crowd with visible frustration before gesturing toward the conservatory, and though propriety screamed against such blatant privacy, Harriet found herself following him through the French doors into the heated air, thick with the scent of night jasmine and rich earth. The conservatory wrapped them in verdant privacy, the distant orchestra rendering their conversation safe from eavesdropping, and Alexander turned to face her, with his careful composure finally cracking as he asked what gossip she had heard that had driven her to refuse his calls, and when she hesitated, he pressed closer, not touching, but near enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the muscle working in his jaw. She whispered the terrible words that she had heard his pursuit of her was a wager, a joke, perhaps charity toward a woman too plain and too old to merit genuine regard, and watched his face transform through shock into something harder and colder than she had yet witnessed as he demanded to know who had spread such lies, though his tone suggested he already suspected. Caroline, Harriet admitted, or at least Caroline set, and Alexander breathed out slowly before taking her hand with a gentleness that contradicted his evident fury, and saying with perfect clarity that there had been no wager, no jest, nothing but his own belated recognition that the woman he had thoughtlessly overlooked possessed more genuine worth than the entirety of society's celebrated beauties combined, and he had bought every waltz in London not as spectacle, but as apology, as declaration, as the only language he could think to speak loudly enough that she might finally believe that he saw her, truly saw her, and found her utterly captivating. May 13th, 1815 arrived with the kind of crystalline morning light that seemed to bless the world with new possibility, and when Alexander Thornhill presented himself at the Sinclair residence at precisely 11 o'clock, carrying a single perfect white rose still beaded with dew from his own gardens, Eleanor Sinclair opened the door herself and studied him with the shrewd assessment of a mother who had watched her daughter suffer too long before stepping aside with a slight smile that held both warning and permission. Harriet stood when he entered the modest drawing-room that now seemed transformed by the sunlight streaming through windows her mother must have deliberately opened wide. And she wore a pale yellow morning dress that brought unexpected warmth to her complexion, while her hands twisted together in a gesture of nervousness that made Alexander's heart clench with tenderness for this woman who had been taught by cruel circumstance to doubt her own worthiness of love. He crossed to her without bothering with the usual social niceties and extended the rose, watching as she took it with trembling fingers before he spoke with a rawness that dispensed entirely with the careful eloquence he had rehearsed through a sleepless night. Telling her that he had spent 32 years moving through a world of exquisite surfaces and carefully performed charm without ever encountering anything real until he had looked across Lady Beaumont's conservatory and seen her standing in ivory silk, with her chin raised in dignity, despite the pain he had thoughtlessly caused. And in that moment he had understood that everything he had previously valued in a woman had been the wrong criteria entirely. Harriet's eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink back as he continued, his voice dropping lower as he stepped closer and took her free hand in both of his own, saying that her intelligence challenged him, her quiet strength humbled him, her grace in the face of society's cruelty shamed him, and her mere presence in a room made him aware of how much of his life he had wasted in the company of people who could not see past their own reflections long enough to recognize genuine worth when it stood before them in a worn blue gown at a ball where she should have been celebrated rather than overlooked. She whispered his name, just Alexander, without his title, and he felt something crack open in his chest at the intimacy of it as she asked through tears whether he truly meant what he was saying, whether this was not some fever dream from which she would wake to find herself still invisible and alone. And he answered by releasing her hand only long enough to frame her face between his palms and kiss her with a tenderness that built slowly into passion before he pulled back just far enough to murmur against her lips that he loved her, that he intended to marry her, that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never doubted her value again. And when she breathed yes as both answer and affirmation, he kissed her again, while the white rose fell forgotten to the floor, and the morning light blessed them both. The fortnight that followed Alexander's declaration unfolded with the quality of a dream from which Harriet kept expecting to wake, beginning on May 15th, when he arrived at the Sinclair residence in an open carriage to take her driving through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour of 5 in the afternoon, and the sight of Miss Harriet Sinclair seated beside the Duke of Thornhill, with his attention so obviously fixed upon her, rather than the crowd, sent ripples of speculation through society that grew stronger with each subsequent appearance they made together at the theatre on May 17th, where Alexander secured a prominent box, and spent more time gazing at Harriet's profile as she watched the performance of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing than at the stage itself, his hand resting possessively over hers on the velvet armrest, in full view of the opera glasses trained upon them from every tier. Eleanor Sinclair watched her daughter's transformation with quiet joy that showed itself in the increasingly fine gowns she insisted upon commissioning, so that when Harriet attended Lady Pemberton's musicale on May 19th, she wore rose silk that brought unexpected color to her complexion, and made her look not beautiful by society's narrow standards, perhaps, but radiant with the particular glow of a woman who knows herself beloved. And Alexander stood beside her chair throughout the performance, with his hand resting lightly on its back, in a gesture of claiming that made his intentions unmistakable to even the most obtuse observer. The whispers that had once mocked now speculated on wedding dates and settlements, and Caroline Pembroke's influence diminished visibly, as former sycophants recognized the shift in social weather and adjusted their allegiances accordingly. Several women who had previously cut Harriet directly, now offering tepid greetings that Alexander acknowledged with cool civility, that made clear he had not forgotten their earlier cruelty, even as he was too well bred to refuse their overtures entirely. On May 22nd, Alexander invited Harriet and her mother to dine at Thornhill House, and Harriet walked through rooms of such grandeur that her old insecurities whispered she did not belong in such spaces, until Alexander took her hand and led her to the portrait gallery, where he showed her paintings of his ancestors, and spoke of how he had always felt the weight of their expectations pressing upon him to make a match that would enhance the family's consequence, and how he had finally understood that true consequence lay not in beauty or connections, but in character and genuine partnership. And he wanted her to know that in choosing her, he was choosing the life he actually wished to live, rather than the one society prescribed. Louisa visited on May 25th, and found her friend altered in ways that went beyond fine clothes, a new confidence visible in how Harriet held herself, and met the eyes of others without the old apologetic quality. And when Louisa remarked upon it with teasing affection, Harriet admitted that being loved by someone who truly saw her had taught her to see herself differently, to recognize that society's standards were arbitrary measures that had nothing to do with actual worth, and she was beginning to believe what Alexander insisted was true, that she possessed value that had always existed even when others had been too blind to perceive it. By May 30th, when Alexander escorted her to Lord Ashworth's ball, Harriet moved through the ballroom that had once intimidated her with quiet grace, and when he claimed her for the supper waltz, the orchestra seemed to play only for them as he held her close and murmured that he had something important to ask her soon, and would she grant him the honor of visiting Thornhill Estate the following week? And Harriet's breathless yes held the knowledge of what question awaited her there. June 1st, 1815 arrived with the luminous quality of high summer's approach, and when Alexander's carriage collected Harriet at 3 in the afternoon for the journey to Thornhill Estate, the anticipation that had kept her awake through the previous night transformed into a trembling excitement that made her grateful for her mother's steadying embrace before departure and the familiar weight of white muslin against her skin. The simple dress chosen because Alexander had once mentioned he preferred her in pale colors that emphasized the directness of her gaze rather than competing with it. The estate revealed itself gradually as the carriage progressed up a winding drive lined with ancient oaks, and Harriet caught her breath at the first sight of Thornhill House rising in golden stone against a sky beginning to deepen toward evening, its classical proportions speaking of generations of wealth and consequence that made her old insecurities whisper she did not belong in such a place until she remembered Alexander's words about choosing the life he wished to live rather than the one society prescribed, and she held that memory close as the carriage drew to a halt before wide steps where he stood waiting in informal riding clothes that somehow made him appear more approachable than his usual formal attire ever did. He handed her down himself without waiting for the footman, and kept her hand tucked into the crook of his arm as he led her not toward the house but around its eastern wing to gardens that spread in terraced beauty down a gentle slope. And Harriet found herself walking through spaces of such carefully cultivated loveliness that she understood these grounds represented not mere display, but genuine love of growing things. The roses especially magnificent in their June abundance, as Alexander guided her deeper into their fragrant embrace until they reached a circular garden enclosed by high hedges where a fountain played its liquid music into the golden light that now slanted toward sunset. He turned to face her then, and Harriet saw in his expression a nervousness she had never witnessed before, a vulnerability that made this powerful duke suddenly appear almost boyish as he took both her hands and told her that he had brought her to this particular spot because it had been planted by his grandmother for his grandfather as a wedding gift, a private place where they could escape the demands of their positions and simply be two people who loved each other, and he wanted Harriet to know that he envisioned such a future with her. A partnership built not on duty or alliance, but on genuine affection and intellectual companionship. And the particular joy he felt whenever she entered a room. Her eyes filled with tears as he released one of her hands to reach into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a ring that caught the sunset light in brilliant blue fire, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that he explained had belonged to that same grandmother, the only woman in his family who had married for love rather than advantage, and he would be honored beyond measure if Harriet would accept it and agree to become his wife, to be his duchess, not because of her family connections, or her fortune, or her beauty by society's arbitrary standards, but because she possessed the qualities that actually mattered: intelligence and kindness, and a strength of character that humbled him every time he witnessed how she maintained her dignity in the face of cruelty she had never deserved. Harriet's yes emerged through tears as Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, where it settled as though it had been made for her alone. And when he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, with a passion tempered by reverence, she tasted salt from her own tears, and felt the solid reality of his embrace anchoring her to this impossible moment, and the roses released their perfume into the golden air, while the fountain sang, and somewhere above them the first evening star appeared to bless their promises with its ancient light. June 8, 1815, arrived with the warmth of true summer settling over London. And by 9 in the evening, Thornhill House blazed with illumination from what seemed like 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers that turned the grand ballroom into a space of such magnificence that even guests accustomed to opulence paused upon entering to take in the spectacle, though the true center of attention was not the lavish decorations of white roses and trailing ivy, or the orchestra positioned on a dais large enough to accommodate 20 musicians, but rather Miss Harriet Sinclair, who stood beside the Duke of Thornhill, receiving guests with a confidence that would have been unimaginable 2 months earlier, when she had been the overlooked wallflower left off his dance card at Lady Harrington's ball. The sapphire gown Eleanor had insisted upon commissioning matched the engagement ring that caught candlelight with every movement of Harriet's left hand, and the color brought out depths in her eyes that several guests remarked upon with what appeared to be genuine admiration rather than the false politeness she had learned to recognize, and Alexander kept her hand tucked possessively into the crook of his arm as he introduced her to relatives and political connections and friends who bowed over her hand with respect that acknowledged her imminent status as Duchess of Thornhill. Louisa arrived early and embraced Harriet with tears of joy bright in her eyes, whispering that she had known from the beginning that Alexander was different from the shallow men who had overlooked her friend's worth. And Eleanor stood nearby in silver silk, looking 10 years younger than she had in April, when resignation had weighted her features as she watched her daughter accept social invisibility as permanent fate. The moment Alexander had orchestrated with particular care came at 10 in the evening, when he raised his hand to still the orchestra and drew Harriet to the center of the ballroom, where chandelier light illuminated them both as he addressed the assembled guests, with a speech that began with gratitude for their attendance, but transformed into something far more significant as he spoke of how society often valued the wrong qualities and overlooked the attributes that actually mattered, and how he had nearly made that mistake himself until circumstances had forced him to truly see the woman who now wore his ring, a woman whose intelligence and kindness and strength of character humbled him daily and made him grateful that fate had given him the wisdom to recognize what others had been too blind to appreciate. Harriet felt tears threatening as Alexander turned to her and continued speaking, but now directly to her rather than the crowd, telling her that she had taught him the difference between the life society prescribed and the life worth living, and he would spend the rest of his days proving himself worthy of the gift of her acceptance. The applause that followed held genuine warmth, with one notable exception, as Caroline Pembroke stood near the entrance in puce silk that did nothing for her complexion, her expression tight with displeasure that she poorly concealed. And when she attempted to approach the receiving line, Lady Beaumont rather pointedly stepped into her path with a comment about the crush being too great for comfort, and Caroline departed early, with her influence diminished beyond recovery, while Harriet danced the first waltz in Alexander's arms in the very ballroom where their future would unfold, and knew that she had moved from invisibility into a life beyond her former capacity to imagine. The 5 weeks between June 15th and Julyth unfolded with the dreamlike quality of a future Harriet had never dared imagine becoming solid reality. And the first indication of how thoroughly her life had transformed came when Alexander arrived at the Sinclair residence on the morning of June 16th with the announcement that he had arranged appointments at London's finest modiste for her wedding trousseau, because while he loved her exactly as she was, he wanted the world to see her dressed in a manner befitting a duchess, and more importantly, he wanted her to possess garments that made her feel as beautiful as he found her. Eleanor wept happy tears as she accompanied her daughter through fittings where silk and satin and fine muslin were draped and pinned, while the modiste who had previously treated Harriet with barely concealed disdain now fawned over the future Duchess of Thornhill with an enthusiasm that would have been laughable had Harriet not been too filled with joy to care about past slights. And when Alexander insisted on being consulted about the wedding gown itself, the modiste nearly swooned at his interest as he examined fabric samples with an attention to detail that revealed genuine care rather than mere masculine tolerance of feminine concerns. The gown that emerged from these consultations would be white silk of such quality that it seemed to glow with inner light. The bodice fitted close with delicate embroidery at the neckline and sleeves that would fall just off the shoulder in the current fashion, and when Harriet stood for fittings and saw herself transformed in the looking-glass, she sometimes had to blink back tears at the realization that this elegant creature was herself and that the life symbolized by such a gown was truly hers to claim. Alexander called daily with such regularity that the Sinclair household grew accustomed to his presence at 11 each morning, and these visits became the anchoring points of Harriet's days as they sat in the modest drawing-room that no longer felt shabby but rather cozy, and discussed everything from the guest list that had swelled to include 200 people to the honeymoon journey. Alexander was planning to his estate in the Lake District, where they could escape society's demands and simply be together without the constant scrutiny that had attended their courtship. Louisa visited frequently with her own excitement barely contained as she helped address invitations in her elegant hand and listened to Harriet's occasional moments of uncertainty when old insecurities would surface like stubborn weeds in a garden, whispering that she did not deserve such happiness or that Alexander might yet realize his mistake. But these doubts grew fewer as the days passed, and Alexander's steadfast devotion never wavered, even when she tested him by mentioning her fears aloud, and he would pull her close and kiss her forehead and tell her that the only mistake would be allowing society's cruel judgments to diminish the joy they had found together. The banns were read at St. George's on the 3rd consecutive Sundays, while summer deepened into its full glory, and London grew warm enough that many families departed for country estates, though none who had received invitations to the wedding of the season would dream of leaving before witnessing the union that had become the talk of every drawing-room and ballroom. And even Caroline Pembroke reportedly remained in town, though she had not responded to her invitation, and Harriet found she could not summon any emotion about that silence, beyond mild relief that her wedding day would not be shadowed by malice from a woman who had never deserved the social power she had wielded so carelessly. July 25th, 1815. Dawned with the kind of brilliant clarity that seemed designed by Providence itself for momentous occasions, and by 10 in the morning, St. George's Church in Hanover Square stood filled with 200 guests, whose murmuring voices created a sound like distant waves as they waited for the ceremony that had become the most anticipated social event of the season. And sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, depicting biblical scenes in jeweled colors that cast patterns of ruby and sapphire and emerald across stone floors worn smooth by generations of worshippers, while the scent of white roses filled the air from arrangements that adorned every available surface until the ancient church seemed transformed into a garden of celestial beauty. Alexander stood at the altar in formal attire of midnight blue that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame, and George Westbrook beside him as groomsman noted with quiet amusement that the Duke of Thornhill, who had faced political adversaries and social machinations with perfect composure, now shifted his weight with barely perceptible nervousness as he waited for his bride, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested he was restraining himself from some impulse that propriety forbade. Eleanor sat in the front pew in dove-grey silk with Louisa beside her, and both women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs as the organist began the processional music that signaled Harriet's arrival, and every head turned toward the entrance, where Harriet appeared on the arm of her uncle, who had agreed to give her away, and the collective intake of breath from the assembled guests created a moment of perfect silence beneath the music as they beheld the transformation of the woman many had dismissed as plain and unremarkable into a bride of such radiant beauty that even those who had whispered cruel judgments about her appearance now found themselves unable to recall what had ever seemed lacking. The white silk gown glowed as though lit from within as she moved down the aisle with measured steps, the bodice fitted to perfection and the skirt falling in elegant folds that whispered against the stone floor, and the embroidery at the neckline and sleeves caught light with each movement, while the veil of Brussels lace that Eleanor had worn at her own wedding 30 years earlier framed Harriet's face like morning mist, and in her hands she carried a simple bouquet of white roses tied with ivory ribbon. Alexander watched her approach with an expression of such unguarded emotion that several guests later remarked they had never seen the usually composed Duke so transparently affected. And when Harriet reached the altar and her uncle placed her hand in Alexander's, the look that passed between them held such intimacy that it seemed almost intrusive to witness, and the vicar began the ancient ceremony with the solemn words that had joined countless couples across centuries, while Harriet stood beside the man who had seen her worth when society had deemed her invisible and felt gratitude so profound it seemed impossible that her heart could contain such fullness without breaking from the pressure of joy. And when the moment came for vows, Alexander's voice rang clear and strong through the church as he promised to love and cherish and honor her for all the days of his life. And Harriet's own voice trembled only slightly as she made the same promises in return, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander lifted her veil to claim the kiss that sealed their union. The applause that erupted from the guests violated church decorum, but no one seemed to care. As the Duke and his new Duchess turned to face the assembled company as man and wife, while the sapphire engagement ring on Harriet's finger was now joined by a gold wedding band that caught morning light as they walked back down the aisle together toward the life they would build as partners in all things. The wedding breakfast at Thornhill House began at noon, with 200 guests flowing from the church into the grand ballroom, where tables draped in white linen held arrangements of white roses and ivy, while servants in formal livery circulated with champagne and delicacies prepared by a French chef Alexander had commissioned specifically for the occasion, and Harriet found herself seated beside her new husband at the head table on a slightly raised dais, where she could survey the assembled company that included every notable family in London society, plus several who had travelled from country estates specifically to attend the wedding that had captured the imagination of the ton. Eleanor sat nearby with tears still glistening on her cheeks as she accepted congratulations from ladies who had previously offered only cool politeness to the mother of an unremarkable spinster, and Louisa glowed with vicarious joy as she moved through the crowd distributing wedding favours of silk ribbon and sugared almonds, while receiving admiring attention from several eligible gentlemen who had apparently decided that the friend of a duchess warranted closer examination. Alexander kept Harriet's hand clasped in his own throughout the meal, with a possessiveness that might have seemed excessive had it not been so clearly born of genuine devotion rather than ownership. And he leaned close several times to whisper observations that made her laugh, or simply to tell her she was beautiful, until she felt herself blushing like a girl of 17 rather than a woman of 28 who had resigned herself to permanent spinsterhood only 3 months earlier. The toast began after the meal with George Westbrook rising to offer remarks that managed to be both witty and sincere, as he spoke of Alexander's transformation from a man weary of society's superficiality to one who had found genuine partnership with a woman of intelligence and character, and several other guests followed with their own tributes, while Harriet sat in amazed gratitude that these same people who had overlooked her for years now competed to praise her virtues as though they had always recognized her worth. Caroline Pembroke had not attended despite receiving an invitation that Harriet had insisted on sending as a gesture of graciousness that Alexander had called both generous and strategic, and her absence created a void that several guests remarked upon with barely concealed satisfaction as they noted how thoroughly her influence had diminished since the Duke had so publicly chosen a woman she had dismissed as beneath notice. The celebration continued through the afternoon with music and dancing, and an elaborate wedding cake of 4 tiers decorated with spun sugar flowers that drew gasps of admiration when it was presented. And Alexander led Harriet onto the floor for their first dance as husband and wife, while the orchestra played the same waltz they had shared at Lord Somerset's ball when her heart had first dared to hope his attentions might be sincere. As the shadows lengthened toward evening, Alexander bent to murmur that their carriage awaited to take them to Thornhill House, where they would spend their wedding night before departing the next morning for the Lake District, and Harriet felt her breath catch at the intimacy promised in his voice as they made their farewells to guests who threw rose petals as the Duke handed his Duchess into the carriage that would carry them toward the private joy that awaited beyond society's watchful eyes. The carriage journey from Thornhill House back to the Duke's London residence took only 20 minutes, but felt suspended outside of time as Harriet sat beside her husband in the intimate darkness punctuated by passing street lamps that illuminated Alexander's face in flickering intervals, and she found herself acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched on the velvet seat, and every catch in her own breathing, as anticipation built with each turn of the wheels that carried them closer to the privacy she both longed for and felt nervously uncertain about, despite the months of growing intimacy that had led to this moment. Alexander kept her hand clasped in both of his with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the intensity she sensed beneath his compassed exterior, and twice he lifted her fingers to his lips in gestures of reverence that made her heart stutter with the realization that this man who commanded such power and respect in society approached their wedding night with a tenderness that honored rather than presumed. When they arrived at the residence, the staff lined the entrance hall to offer congratulations with genuine warmth that reflected how thoroughly the household had embraced their new mistress, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, presented Harriet with a bouquet of lavender from the estate gardens tied with white ribbon as a traditional blessing for marital happiness, while Alexander stood at her side with proprietary pride that declared to everyone present that the Duchess of Thornhill would be cherished and protected within these walls. The master suite had been prepared with care that showed in every detail, from the fire crackling in the hearth, despite the summer warmth, to the champagne chilling in a silver bucket, to the rose petals scattered across surfaces that caught candlelight like captured rubies. And when Alexander led her across the threshold and closed the door behind them, the click of the latch seemed to seal them into a world that contained only the two of them, and the future they would create together. Harriet stood in the center of the room, suddenly uncertain, despite the months of courtship and the vows spoken only hours earlier, and she felt the weight of 28 years of being overlooked and dismissed press against the joy that wanted to overflow, as she wondered whether she would know how to be the wife such a man deserved. But Alexander crossed to her with measured steps and cupped her face in his hands with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes as he told her she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and the only woman he had ever wanted to spend his life learning to love more deeply with each passing day. He kissed her then with a reverence that gradually deepened into passion as his hands moved to the buttons at the back of her traveling dress, while she trembled not from fear but from the overwhelming reality that this was truly happening, and she was truly wanted, and the loneliness that had defined her existence for so long was being banished by the touch of a man who had seen her worth when no one else had cared to look beyond society's shallow judgments. The morning after their wedding arrived, with golden July sunlight streaming through the windows of the master suite at Thornhill House to illuminate Harriet as she lay beside her husband in the vast four-poster bed with its navy silk hangings, and she found herself blinking awake slowly with an awareness that her entire world had shifted during the night, as Alexander had loved her with a tenderness and passion that had banished every remaining shadow of doubt about her worthiness to be cherished by such a man. He still slept beside her with one arm draped possessively across her waist, and his face softened by slumber into an expression of peace that made her heart clench with protective tenderness. And she took the opportunity to study him without the self-consciousness that sometimes still crept in when his intense gaze focused on her, despite the months of courtship and the vows that now bound them together for life. The intimacy of watching him sleep felt almost scandalous after 28 years of rigid propriety. Yet it was her right now, as his wife, to observe the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, and the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, and the way his fingers twitched slightly, as though even in sleep he sought to hold on to her. She thought of the girl she had been just 3 months ago, standing at Lady Harrington's ball in her outdated blue gown, believing herself invisible and unworthy of notice. And the transformation between that resigned spinster and the Duchess of Thornhill, who now lay in her husband's bed, felt so complete that she might have been such two entirely different people were it not for the thread of essential self that connected them both. Alexander stirred then, and his eyes opened to focus on her with an expression of such profound satisfaction that she felt herself blushing despite everything they had shared during the night. And he pulled her closer to murmur good morning against her hair, before kissing her with a leisurely thoroughness that suggested he had no intention of rising any time soon, despite the fact that their carriage for the Lake District was scheduled to depart at noon. She melted into his embrace with a willingness that would have shocked her former self, and for long moments there was no sound in the room except their mingled breathing and the distant song of birds in the garden beyond the windows, as the Duke and his Duchess began their first full day of married life, with the kind of intimate joy that society's rules had prevented during their courtship, but which was now not only permitted but expected. When they finally rose and rang for breakfast to be brought to their chambers, Harriet felt wonderfully scandalous sitting across from Alexander in her dressing gown, with her hair unpinned, while he looked at her as though she were the most precious thing he had ever possessed, and she realized with quiet amazement that this was now her life, that every morning would begin this way with this man who had seen her worth when no one else had bothered to look, and that the loneliness she had carried for so long had been permanently vanquished by a love she had never dared to dream might be hers.